Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Right, like it's engineering or something.
Exactly. A patient comes in, they've injured their arm. The X-ray shows that unmistakable jagged white line across the radius, and the doctor just points to the screen.
Broken or not broken, very clean.
Yeah, it's clean, it's visible, and honestly, it's comforting. We like things to be categorized neatly. But, then you step into the world of global public health, specifically looking at the health of indigenous populations worldwide, and suddenly that X-ray machine is entirely useless.
Oh, completely useless. The diagnostic landscape gets incredibly murky.
Right, because we're looking at a landscape where the causes of disease aren't just biological pathogens. They're historical events, legal definitions, and, well, centuries-old political frameworks. So welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we have a very specific mission for you, the learner. We're acting as your companion guide to Chapter 10.6 of the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health, which focuses on the health of Indigenous peoples.
And our goal today is to really engineer a fundamental shift in how you process this information.
Moving beyond the rote memorization.
Precisely. We're moving far beyond just memorizing a list of grim statistics or reading off a table of contents. We want to provide a structured, conceptual deep dive to strengthen your clinical reasoning and support your active reading.
Yeah, so when you look at public health data tomorrow, you actually understand the mechanisms of health inequity.
Right. Why do these disparities exist? How do systemic failures manifest as actual biological illness?
To help visualize this, I want to introduce an overarching metaphor that will, carry through our entire time together today. Think of it as the river system of health.
I love this metaphor.
It really works.
Okay.
Right? Imagine health outcomes not as a static snapshot on a chart, but as a massive, continuous flowing river. When you analyze a river, you have to look at three distinct zones. First, there's the upstream. This is the source of the waters.
Which, in our context today, the upstream is the historical context, the political frameworks, and the foundational legal sovereignty of a people.
Right. And then moving down from the source, you hit the midstream. This is the current, the actual flow of the river that shapes the landscape.
And in public health, that midstream represents the social determinants of health, the methods we use to collect data, systemic institutional barriers, and, well, the continuity of culture.
Yeah. And finally, you have the downstream. This is where the water pools. This is the clinic.
The clinical outcomes.
Exactly. The morbidity rates, the mortality gaps, the specific diseases we actually treat in a hospital setting.
And the central premise we really need to establish here is that public health and modern medicine have historically spent almost all of their resources desperately trying to treat the downstream symptoms.
Just scooping water out of the pool.
Yes. A patient arrives with a complex chronic illness, and the system attempts to manage that illness in total isolation.
Right.
But this deep dive is designed to pull you upstream.
We're going to explore how colonization, land dispossession, and structural exclusion generate those toxic currents that inevitably result in downstream biological health disparities.
But, before we can even begin to measure the health of Indigenous peoples, we run into a massive conceptual roadblock.
Figuring out who we're actually talking about.
Exactly. The very concept of indigeneity is highly contested. There is this profound tension between a group's fundamental right to self-identification and the rigid labels that get assigned to them by international legal and health bodies.
It's a heavy tension. And it varies wildly depending on the specific geography and history of a region.
It does. When you analyze the global landscape, a crucial differentiation emerges. You have regions with relatively clear binary colonial histories, and then regions with incredibly complex, multi-layered histories of migration and conquest.
Let's look at the clear lines first. A clear line would be a place where external foreign powers arrived at a specific documented historical moment. They colonized the region, dispossessed the original inhabitants, and forcibly established distinct legal and social boundaries.
Between the native peoples and the new settler population.
Right. You see this distinct dynamic with Aboriginal Australians, the Maori in New Zealand, and First Nations peoples across the Americas.
There's a very defined before and after regarding the arrival of the colonizing power. The power dynamic shifted abruptly and violently.
But then you shift your focus to Africa, Asia, or the Middle East, and those neat conceptual boxes completely fall apart.
Oh, they shatter, because the history of human movement in those regions is incredibly deep.
Look at the San and Pygmy peoples in Africa. Many observers might argue, well, aren't all native Africans indigenous relative to European colonization?
which is a common question.
Yeah. Why do the San and Pygmy people specifically claim indigenous status? Well, they claim it because they were essentially marginalized or displaced by other African agricultural societies long before European colonizers ever set foot on the continent.
And the complexity is even more pronounced in a country like India.
Right, because of the social hierarchies.
Exactly. India has deeply entrenched social hierarchies that created categories at birth. Certain groups are designated as tribal or indigenous, based almost entirely on a sociocultural basis, often related to their historical position outside the traditional caste system.
Rather than a single sweeping event of foreign invasion.
Right. The history of migration, integration, and conquest in these regions is layered like a deeply complex geological formation.
And this definitional complexity, it isn't just an academic debate for anthropologists. It actually caused a massive fracture in the public health world back in 2006.
The Lancet debate.
Right. The medical journal The Lancet was preparing to publish a special series on global indigenous health. And a prominent anthropologist named Adam Cooper essentially wrote to the editorial board and said, don't do it, scrap the project.
He argued against even using the term indigenous in a medical context.
Which sounds wild today, but Cooper's argument was rooted in a very real historical fear. He argued that the term indigenous is frequently weaponized as a polite, modern euphemism for primitive.
Right. His primary concern was that by categorizing specific health crises under an indigenous label, the medical community was inadvertently biologizing social issues.
He was warning against that dangerous trap of presuming that poor health outcomes are somehow inherent to a person's genetics or their essential nature as an indigenous person.
Which is a very heavy accusation to level at a public health initiative, to say you are subtly promoting biological determinism.
But the public health community pushed back hard. They didn't scrap the series.
No, they didn't. Instead, they explicitly countered Cooper by anchoring indigenous health perfectly within the social determinants of health paradigm.
The inequalities aren't coded in the DNA. They are coded in the structure of society.
Exactly. The public health defense was vital there. They clarified that viewing health through an indigenous lens is fundamentally an analysis of structural inequity.
The disproportionate rates of disease aren't occurring because a population is biologically indigenous.
No, they're occurring precisely because of what has been systematically done to that population, politically, economically, and socially over successive generations.
Defining indigeneity is like trying to draw permanent borders on a rushing river. The water is always moving, populations intermarry, cultures adapt and evolve. But, I want to pause here and really push back on this from a pure, on-the-ground clinical perspective.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's say I'm a physician working in a remote clinic. If a community has obvious, glaring health needs, if they're suffering from disproportionately high rates of infectious disease or maternal mortality, why does public health even need a strict international legal definition of their indigeneity?
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, can't we just focus the resources on treating the sick people in front of us, regardless of what legal box they check?
That is the natural clinical instinct, right? Treat the patient in front of you. But if you rely only on that instinct, you will be trapped endlessly treating the downstream symptoms while the upstream source continues to poison the water.
Because the legal definitions matter upstream.
They are the ultimate upstream determinants of health. Why? Because legal definitions directly dictate land title. They dictate the allocation of and access to natural resources.
And political sovereignty.
Exactly. If a community is not legally recognized as indigenous by the state they reside in, they are inherently cut off from the specific resources, treaty rights, and specialized funding streams that were designed to repair historical dispossession.
Wow. So you cannot effectively resolve a community's malnutrition or housing crisis in the clinic if that community has no legal right to the land they live on or the resources they need to build an economy.
You literally can. The legal definition itself becomes a matter of biological survival. If your identity isn't recognized, the resources to sustain your health just don't exist.
That forces us to look really closely at the framework scholars and governments actually use to categorize this identity. Because if the definition dictates survival, well, the framework dictates the definition.
Right, and there are two primary models at play here, the cultural framework and the political framework.
Let's evaluate the cultural model first. This approach attempts to define indigenous peoples primarily by their cultural characteristics, almost always by contrasting them with modernized urban capitalist societies.
It focuses heavily on populations that live in small-scale societies, utilizing traditional economies like hunting and gathering, relying on non-intensive agriculture, and maintaining deeply integrated kinship networks.
The archetypes that usually spring to mind for this model would be the Aboriginal Australians, historically, or
Yeah.
the Sand Peoples in southern Africa. It's a very visually distinct way of defining a group.
But there are massive, glaring critiques of this cultural model.
Oh, yeah. The biggest being that it completely fails to account for any modernized, urbanized, or economically integrated indigenous populations.
It forces Indigenous identity into a static, museum exhibit view of humanity. It implies that authenticity requires freezing a culture in time.
Right. But what happens when you look at the descendants of the Mayan and Incan civilizations in Central and South America today?
Or consider the Amerindians in Guyana.
Yeah, Amerindians make up roughly 9.2% of Guyana's total population. Many of them exist largely outside the formal cash economy and represent the most impoverished demographic in a country that already ranks very low on the Global Human Development Index.
Or look at the modern San people in southern Africa. Yes, they have an incredible 27,000-year continuous history in the region, and they lived a highly specialized hunter-gatherer lifestyle until very recently. But the reality is that most San people today live sedentary lifestyles.
So, under a strict cultural model, if a San person takes a job in a cash economy to feed their family, or if an Aboriginal Australian moves to Sydney to attend university, the framework struggles to classify them.
It essentially argues you've changed your economic mode of survival, therefore you are somehow less indigenous.
Which is an absurd and punishing standard. It strips people of their agency to adapt, and that glaring flaw pushes us toward the second framework, right? The political model.
Exactly. The political model shifts the lens entirely away from cultural practices and focuses on power dynamics. It emphasizes political characteristics, specifically focusing on a group's minority status and their subordinate relationship to settler societies.
It anchors indigenous identity in the shared historical experience of forced dispossession from traditional lands.
Yes, and the subsequent legal management or subjugation of that population by modern settler states.
But, this model isn't bulletproof either. The political model heavily leans on the assumption that indigenous people are a demographic minority within the state.
But the demographic realities contradict that in many places.
Right. Look at the indigenous populations in Fiji, where they maintain dominant political status and land rights. Or look at Bolivia, where indigenous peoples make up the actual demographic majority of the country.
You can't define indigeneity strictly by minority status if they are the majority.
Exactly. And this analytical friction forces us to ask a crucial question. How do we accurately conceptualize this identity without falling into these reductive traps?
To build a robust framework, we have to explicitly break down the differences between race, ethnicity, and indigeneity.
Okay, let's do that. In modern public health and sociology, race is universally recognized as a socially constructed category.
It has no true biological basis. It was historically engineered based on biological essentialism, arbitrarily dividing humans based on superficial physical appearances to justify hierarchies.
It's the old, thoroughly debunked pseudoscience that claimed humans are divided into distinct biological subspecies with inherent traits.
Exactly. It's an assigned category. Then, moving away from race, you have ethnicity. Scholars define ethnicity as a voluntaristic self-identification with a group culture.
So it's about shared language, shared traditions, shared history.
Right. But researchers Ford and Hurawa offer a much more powerful, nuanced definition that bridges the gap for public health. They argue that ethnicity is actually a two-dimensional construct.
Okay, what are the dimensions?
The first dimension is attributional, the shared cultural characteristics we just mentioned. But the second, critical dimension is relational. It indexes a group's location within a social hierarchy.
And this is where the framework finally clicks into place. When we apply that two-dimensional concept to indigeneity, we see that indigeneity requires an understanding of a very specific, violent type of social stratification.
Yes. It is an identity fundamentally forged in the fires of colonialism. It's the enforced differentiation of civic status between the original inhabitants of a land and the incoming settler populations.
That is the core mechanism. So being indigenous is less about whether a community lives in a remote forest and practices traditional agriculture and far more about their structural, hierarchical, and historical relationship to the state that colonized them.
The identity is inherently political because the trauma, the marginalization, and the dispossession were explicit political acts.
And if indigenous identity is fundamentally a political relationship born of colonization, then the literal laws a country writes to define that relationship become matters of life and death.
Absolutely. The state's legal code acts as a massive valve on the river of health, determining who gets resources and who is structurally abandoned.
Look at how international law has struggled to manage this. The evolution of international indigenous rights has been a notoriously slow, arduous process.
You can trace the early, flawed attempts back to the League of Nations prior to the Second World War. That eventually evolved into efforts by the International Labor Organization, or ILO.
Right. In 1989, we saw the adoption of ILO Convention 169, which attempted to formally define tribal and indigenous peoples based on historical continuity and their distinct social, economic, and cultural institutions.
It was a step, but a limited one.
The true watershed moment, the one that reshaped the global dialogue, occurred in 2007. The United Nations General Assembly adopted UNDIIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Which remains the most comprehensive, sweeping statement of indigenous rights ever produced on a global scale. It addresses rights to self-determination, traditional lands, and cultural continuity.
But analyzing the political context of its passing is deeply revealing about the mechanics of state power. When UNDIIP was brought to the floor, 143 nations voted in favor of adopting it.
But 4 nations voted against it initially.
Right. Those 4 dissenting nations were Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, the 4 major, highly developed settler colonial states.
Now, to be clear on the timeline, all 4 of those nations eventually reversed their positions and endorsed the declaration, the U.S. being the last to do so in 2010.
But that initial coordinated hesitation is fascinating. Why did the wealthiest nations balk? It speaks volumes about the legal terror associated with recognizing collective rights.
The resistance is almost always anchored in the fear of relinquishing land title and acknowledging sovereignty.
Right, because acknowledging collective rights opens the door to massive legal claims regarding stolen land and extracted resources.
Exactly. And we see different manifestations of this exact same state fear in other parts of the world, handled through sheer bureaucratic erasure.
Like in China.
Yes. For instance, in 1995, China officially communicated to the UN that they had, quote, no indigenous peoples question, despite having vast populations that fit the criteria.
They stated they sympathized with the plight of indigenous peoples elsewhere, but claimed it wasn't a domestic issue.
It's the strategy of defining the problem out of existence. We see a similar bureaucratic maneuver in Myanmar.
Right. In Myanmar, roughly 68% of the population belongs to one dominant ethnic group, the Myanmar. The government refers to its many other minority populations not as indigenous, but as ethnic nationalities.
And Thailand utilizes a similar tactic, referring to its original inhabitants as hill tribes or simply ethnic minorities.
So the precise terminology used by the state is a calculated legal defense.
It absolutely is. Classifying a deeply rooted population as merely an ethnic minority rather than an indigenous people allows a nation-state to neatly sidestep the immense implications of collective land rights and self-determination that come heavily loaded with the term indigenous under international law.
It neutralizes the threat to state sovereignty. However, there are instances of structural progress, right?
Yes. Japan, for example, officially recognized the Ainu people of northern Japan in 2008 as an indigenous population with a distinct culture and language, reversing centuries of forced assimilation policies.
So, how a nation legally structures its recognition changes everything downstream. Let's contrast the constitutional approaches of 2 of those major settler states, Australia and Canada.
That's a great comparison. In Australia, the original constitution actually contained 2 explicit race clauses that actively excluded Aboriginal people from being counted in the national census and prevented the federal government from making specialized laws for them.
Wow. And it wasn't until a massive public referendum in 1967 that those clauses were finally deleted.
Right. That legal deletion was required to allow the Commonwealth government to get directly involved in funding and shaping Indigenous policy. And because of that constitutional shift, the Australian government was forced to develop a working administrative definition.
By 1981, they settled on a 3-part definition of Aboriginality, which relied on descent, self-identification, and community acceptance. It created a framework for inclusion.
Now, contrast that delayed federal involvement with Canada. Canada's 1982 Constitution Act took a highly categorized approach. It legally defined 3 distinct Indigenous groups: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis.
But it also created a complex, fragmented system of responsibility. The federal government assumed responsibility for status Indians living on designated reserves, while the provincial governments were largely left to handle services for non-status individuals or those living off reserve.
And the downstream clinical impact of this is profound. This kind of fragmented legal recognition engineers what policy scholars call differentiated citizenship.
Differentiated citizenship.
Yes. Your specific legal status, for example, whether you hold a card identifying you as a status Indian versus a non-status Indian in Canada, acts as a bureaucratic gatekeeper. It directly regulates your ability to access specialized federal health funding, pharmaceutical coverage, or specific clinical services.
Just imagine being a patient trying to navigate that. You have diabetes, you need insulin. But whether your medication is covered depends entirely on how a constitutional act from 1982 categorized your great-grandparents' relationship to the government.
It's the ultimate upstream choke point.
Yeah. If a state doesn't legally recognize a people, they simply don't count them in this system. And if they don't count them, those people become statistically invisible.
Which brings us to one of the most persistent structural failures in this field, the data deficit.
Oh, this is a huge issue.
Massive. When epidemiologists attempt to map global Indigenous health, the single most frustrating reality is that the data is profoundly fragmented, chronically incomplete, or entirely non-existent.
The fidelity of public health data relies completely on the capacity and, more importantly, the political willingness of nation-states to monitor these populations.
We need to dissect the actual mechanisms of this data failure. Why is it so hard to count people? The failures essentially break down into two categories: technical failures and social failures.
Let's look at the technical barriers first. Often, epidemiologists are dealing with relatively small population sizes. In the United States, for instance, American Indians and Alaska Natives make up roughly 1.6% of the total population.
And they are often highly dispersed across vast rural or remote geographic areas, making standardized sampling mathematically difficult.
And compounding the issue of geography is the rampant problem of misclassification at the point of care.
Right. A patient might walk into an urban clinic, and the intake staff or physician simply assumes the patient's race based on superficial physical appearance, logging it incorrectly in the electronic health record without ever asking.
Which ruins the data pool. Furthermore, when you look at regions like Latin America and the Caribbean, which are home to an estimated 400 distinct indigenous groups, national health data is frequently not disaggregated by ethnicity.
The state just lumps everyone into a single national statistical pool.
Yeah, this bureaucratic blending completely erases the specific localized health burdens of the indigenous populations.
But, we have to look deeper than just the technical side.
Right, okay, I actually have to push back on the technical difficulty argument here.
Go for it.
We live in an era of unprecedented data collection. I mean, I can order a highly specific pair of socks online and track the package globally in real time down to the minute it arrives on my porch. Retailers know my exact demographic profile.
True.
Why is it so technically insurmountable to just accurately ask and record a patient's identity in a modern healthcare setting? Is it really a software glitch, or is something else happening?
Your skepticism is entirely justified. The technology to capture this data absolutely exists. The breakdown isn't happening in the software, it's happening in the social interaction.
The social failures.
Exactly. You are pointing directly at the social mechanisms of data failure, which are infinitely more powerful than the technical ones. You have to account for the human element of trust. There is a deep, historically validated, and entirely rational mistrust of government institutions among many indigenous populations globally.
Because historically, whenever an indigenous person voluntarily put their name on a government list, it didn't lead to better health care. It led to forced assimilation, child removal policies, or land confiscation.
Precisely. From a public health perspective, we have to recognize the severe difference between health surveillance and community trust.
That's a critical distinction.
It is. When an institution attempts data surveillance without having built community trust, that data collection is experienced by the community as policing. It feels extractive, not supportive.
Consequently, people are highly reluctant to identify their indigenous status on government medical forms.
Combine that entirely rational self-protection with investigator bias and a systemic failure of researchers to establish meaningful rapport, and the data simply disappears.
But we must remember a crucial maxim in epidemiology. The absence of data does not mean the absence of disease. It reflects a system functioning exactly as it was designed to exclude.
So what does an epidemiologist do when the specific data they need simply doesn't exist? They have to use proxies. They look for shadows on the wall.
It's like in Cambodia.
Hmm.
For example, the indigenous populations are heavily concentrated in the northeastern provinces.
Right.
The national government reports might refuse to disaggregate health data specifically for indigenous individuals. But if you zoom out and look at the Human Development Index across the country, those specific northeastern provinces consistently register the absolute lowest HDI in the nation.
The regional poverty becomes the proxy for the indigenous health burden.
Exactly. And we rely on similar grim proxies in India. India officially recognizes around 532 scheduled tribes. While exact, disaggregated clinical data for every tribe is severely lacking, we know where these populations are geographically concentrated.
In rural India, scheduled tribes suffer from the highest proportion of extreme poverty of any recognized social group, hovering around 54%.
If you analyze a state like Bihar, which has a significant tribal population, it suffers from the highest poverty rate in the country and staggering childhood mortality rates of 136 deaths per 1,000 live births.
We use regional economic despair and massive mortality rates as a proxy to understand the invisible indigenous health crisis.
Despite these massive systemic blind spots in the data, the numbers we do manage to collect paint a stark, undeniable picture. When you map out the global health data, a staggering, unbroken rule emerges.
Yes, the epidemiological reality is absolute. There are no known cases globally where indigenous populations exceed non-indigenous populations on key headline health indicators. Not a single instance. The gap is universal.
Let's ground that in the numbers, starting with life expectancy. Data from Australia spanning 2005 to 2007 revealed a life expectancy gap of 11.5 years for Indigenous males and 9.7 years for Indigenous females compared to the general Australian population.
In New Zealand, by 2006, the gap for the Maori population had narrowed due to targeted interventions, but it still sat at a devastating 8 years.
And the projections for Canada are equally alarming. Projections models for 2017 estimated the life expectancy for Inuit men at just 64 years compared to 79 years for the total Canadian male population.
We are talking about a 15-year gap in life expectancy within a highly developed, resource-rich, universal healthcare system. That gap represents decades of stolen time, driven entirely by structural inequity.
Public health also relies heavily on infant mortality rates, which act as a sentinel indicator. Infant mortality isn't just about babies. It's a reflection of maternal health, nutrition, sanitation, and the overall baseline health of a society.
The data here is bifurcated. The gap is finally closing in some wealthy nations, for instance. The disparity has largely closed for Native Hawaiians.
But in poorer developing nations, the infant mortality gap between indigenous and non-indigenous populations remains a chasm.
When analyzing these indicators, we need to introduce a critical conceptual differentiation for you, the learner. When evaluating public health data, you must understand the vital difference between absolute progress and relative inequality.
It is incredibly easy to misinterpret data if you conflate the two.
It really is. We can use New Zealand as a brilliant textbook case study to illustrate this specific epidemiological trap.
Walk us through the math on this. How can things get better and worse at the same time?
Consider the period between 1981 and 2004 in New Zealand. During this time, the all-cause mortality rate for the Maori population steadily decreased. This means fewer people were dying across all age groups and disease categories.
In epidemiology, that is classified as an absolute gain. It's an undeniable public health victory. The line on the graph goes down. That's what every health minister wants to see.
Exactly. However, during that exact same 23-year period, the all-cause mortality rate for the European New Zealander population also decreased, but it decreased at a significantly faster rate.
Oh, wow.
So even though Maori health was genuinely improving in an absolute sense, the relative disparity between the two groups actually increased. The standardized mortality rate ratios widened, the gap got bigger.
So, what does this conceptual trap mean for you listening right now? It means that when you are reading a news study or listening to a government press release touting how much a specific health metric has improved for a marginalized group, you always have to ask the secondary question. Are we celebrating absolute progress while completely ignoring relative inequity?
Are we patting ourselves on the back because the water level is rising slightly for everyone, while purposefully ignoring the fact that one group is still treading water in a storm while the other is cruising by in a luxury lot?
It's a vital critical thinking skill. You have to measure the gap itself, not just the individual trajectories of the populations.
And to truly understand what is driving that persistent mortality gap, we have to shift our focus from the broad indicators to the specific biological realities. We need to look at the patterns of morbidity, or what epidemiologists refer to as the epidemiological transition.
Indigenous populations today are trapped in a profoundly complex epidemiological state known as the double burden of disease.
They are essentially caught in the crossfire between two distinct public health eras.
It's like fighting a war for survival on two distinct fronts. Your community is still battling the historical infectious diseases of the past, while simultaneously getting flanked by the modern chronic diseases of the present.
Let's examine the first front, infectious diseases. While the developed world has largely moved past these, infectious diseases remain devastating in marginalized pockets globally.
HIV/AIDS continues to ravage specific populations, driven downstream by upstream factors like extreme poverty, homelessness, and a total lack of culturally safe access to preventative care.
In Latin America and the Caribbean, neglected tropical diseases, NTDs, such as Chagas disease, leishmaniasis, and hookworm are incredibly prevalent, thriving in areas of extreme poverty and inadequate sanitation that disproportionately overlap with indigenous territories.
But when you look at the clinical data, there is one specific highlight regarding infectious disease that is absolutely jarring. It's the data on acute rheumatic fever in New Zealand.
Rheumatic fever is a glaring, tragic indicator of upstream systemic failure.
How so?
Well, biologically, rheumatic fever often begins as a highly common, easily treatable strep throat infection. But if that simple infection goes untreated due to lack of medical access, the body's immune system mounts an abnormal, hyperactive autoimmune response.
Which is devastating.
It is. This response violently attacks the body's own tissues, leading to severe, permanent damage to the heart valves. Now, in the vast majority of the developed world, rheumatic heart disease has been functionally eradicated. For the non-Maori, non-Pacific populations in New Zealand, the rate is roughly 1 case per 100,000 people.
But the rate for Maori and Pacific children is staggering. It sits between 40 to 100 cases per 100,000.
We are looking at a rate up to 100 times higher for a disease process that is entirely preventable with a basic course of antibiotics and living conditions that don't promote rapid bacterial transmission.
It is fundamentally the disease of structural violence.
Right.
It thrives in conditions of household crowding, moldy housing, poverty, and a profound lack of accessible primary care.
So, while infectious diseases like rheumatic fever are still ravaging these pockets, we must look at the second front of the double burden, the massive global shift toward non-communicable diseases, or NCDs.
The scale of the NCD burden is immense. In Australia, a comprehensive burden of disease analysis revealed that NCDs, which encompass cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, chronic respiratory diseases, and mental health conditions, account for a staggering 70% of the total disease burden gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.
And hidden within this overwhelming NCD category is a deeply troubling epidemiological anomaly that demands our attention. It is known as the cancer survival paradox.
And again, we see this clearly documented in New Zealand.
Yes.
Let's unpack this paradox because it forces us to look at the healthcare system itself. The registry data shows that the Maori population actually has a lower or statistically similar incidence, meaning the rate of new cases for certain specific cancers, such as melanoma and bowel cancer, when compared to the non-Maori population.
But despite developing the cancer at the exact same or lower rates, Maori patients have a significantly, disproportionately higher mortality rate from those exact same cancers.
How does that make any logical, clinical sense?
When researchers and clinicians rigorously dug into the mechanisms driving this paradox, they found the answers had absolutely nothing to do with genetics or inherent biological vulnerability to tumor growth. The paradox is driven entirely by a systemic failure of the healthcare apparatus to serve the patient.
Okay, break that down for us.
The higher mortality is driven first by delayed diagnosis. Systemic barriers mean these patients are catching the cancer at a much later, more advanced, and deadlier stage. It's driven by poor access to specialized oncology services.
Because they might live in rural areas or face institutional racism.
Exactly. And critically, it's driven by the presence of unmanaged patient comorbidities. If an Indigenous patient has poorly managed diabetes, hypertension, or cardiovascular disease because they face lifelong structural barriers to primary care, their body is simply far less likely to survive the grueling, toxic surgical and chemical treatments required to eradicate the cancer.
The failures cascade. The lack of primary care upstream guarantees a failure in oncology downstream. The morbidities compound.
And we also have to acknowledge the massive burden of mental health conditions, intentional self-harm, suicide, and substance use disorders.
These aren't just isolated psychiatric issues. The research cites a harrowing study from Kinshasa in the Russian north, where alcohol poisoning alone accounted for 26% of all violent deaths among indigenous peoples between 1958 and 1993.
This level of community devastation isn't about millions of simultaneous poor individual choices. This is the physical, societal manifestation of immense historical trauma, forced relocation, and ongoing social marginalization.
Which is why simply identifying the morbidity patterns is only half the battle. We have the grim data. The infinitely harder question for public health professionals is, how do we actually engineer public health strategies that work, that reverse these trends?
That question pushes us into the realm of solutions, specifically the necessary monumental shift from colonial paternalism to genuine partnership.
The foundational principle here is that effective indigenous health strategies require massive structural reform. You cannot reverse centuries of systemic exclusion by just tweaking clinical downstream interventions.
Global bodies like the UN and the Pan American Health Organization, PAH, have developed frameworks that demand the implementation of culturally appropriate care, the formal integration of traditional healers into the medical system, and strategies that target specific community vulnerabilities.
Vulnerabilities such as environmental degradation from mining or the health impacts of forced relocation.
Right, and one of the most important conceptual distinctions to grasp when evaluating these systems is the difference between access and utilization.
On paper, if a health minister just looks at a geographic map, access to primary care clinics might look perfectly equal for everyone. The physical brick-and-mortar clinics exist in the community.
But utilization metrics tell an entirely different, much darker story. Let's return to the concept of ambulatory sensitive conditions. Indigenous populations frequently experience much higher rates of hospital admission for these specific conditions.
Break down what an ambulatory sensitive condition actually looks like in practice.
An ambulatory sensitive condition is a health issue that, if treated effectively, early, and continuously in a primary care outpatient setting, should theoretically never escalate to the point of requiring an emergency hospital admission.
Think of a child with asthma, a patient with a developing skin infection, or someone with early-stage uncontrolled diabetes.
Exactly. If we see high rates of emergency hospital admissions for these exact conditions within a specific demographic, it is absolute, undeniable proof that the primary care system upstream is failing to meet the actual needs of that community.
The physical clinic might be sitting right there on the street corner, but if the community doesn't utilize it, the system has failed.
The clinic might be understaffed, economically inaccessible, plagued by institutional racism, or simply untrusted.
This highlights the core fallacy of biomedical interventionism. If we just parachute a multi-million-dollar, state-of-the-art medical clinic into the center of a community, but we completely ignore the fact that the community lacks access to clean drinking water, or that their housing is infested with respiratory-destroying mold,
or that they harbor a profound, historically justified mistrust of anyone wearing a government badge.
Right, aren't we just throwing expensive bandages at a gaping wound?
Exactly. This is why addressing the social determinants of health poverty, housing stability, early childhood education, employment is so radically critical. We have to move far beyond just handing out pamphlets telling people to exercise more and eat better diets they can't afford.
However, the academic literature notes a very interesting, sobering debate here. In standard public health theory, we rely heavily on the concept of the social gradient,
which is the general idea that as a person's socioeconomic status goes up, as they get more money in education, their health outcomes improve in a relatively neat, predictable, linear fashion.
The richer you are, the healthier you are.
Generally, across most populations, yes. But systematic reviews of empirical research, specifically looking at Indigenous Australians, found that this standard social gradient is significantly less universal and far less consistent.
Wait, really? The wealth doesn't protect them?
Not always. The data showed that even when an Indigenous individual's socioeconomic status improves, even when they get the better job or the higher degree, their health gains don't always match the health gains of the dominant non-Indigenous population.
Why?
Because income alone cannot instantly erase the unique, compounding intergenerational factor of colonization and the ongoing physiological toll of systemic racism.
Which brings us to perhaps the single most overlooked, undervalued determinant of health in standard Western medical training: culture. We have to examine culture not as a quirk, but as a clinical determinant.
Standard rigid biomedicine has historically viewed a patient's culture as a barrier, an obstacle to be overcome through education, so the patient will just comply and take their prescribed pills.
But the modern public health framework flips this completely. Culture is increasingly recognized as a profound protective determinant of health.
UNDRIP, specifically in Articles 5, 8, and 11, explicitly protects the right of Indigenous peoples to cultural continuity. It protects their right to avoid forced assimilation and to maintain, protect, and develop their traditional medicines and health practices.
But the analysis here has to remain sharp. We can't romanticize culture into something static. Culture is dynamic. Indigenous peoples actively exercise agency in their health behaviors, adopting and adapting new practices.
And any honest public health framework has to address the difficult realities without slipping back into colonial lecturing. It requires a delicate balance of dealing with objectively harmful cultural norms or behaviors.
Things like rising rates of substance abuse, gender-based violence, or poor nutritional choices that might have developed and taken root within a community.
And the key mechanism for addressing those harmful behaviors is the absolute avoidance of paternalism. The need to modify unhealthy behaviors exists in all human cultures globally, not just indigenous ones.
Right.
The empirical evidence strongly argues that the only effective, lasting way to change deeply ingrained behaviors is when the demand for change and the design of the intervention is entirely indigenous-led. Top-down, colonial-style lecturing from external health authorities simply does not work. In fact, it often breeds further justifiable resistance and deepens the mistrust.
We also have to shine a harsh light on the pathology of racism itself, because racism is not just a bad social attitude or a political talking point. It is a measurable, profound biological hazard.
The scientific literature, notably Parody's extensive research, documents the severe, direct biological impact of intercultural racism. We need to clearly understand the physiological mechanism of allostatic load.
Allostatic load.
Yes, racism doesn't just hurt feelings. It acts directly on the human body through chronic, unremitting stress pathways. When a person constantly faces discrimination, microaggressions, or systemic barriers, their brain perceives a constant state of threat.
The HPA axis activates, and their body is continually flooded with stress hormones, primarily cortisol.
Over years and decades, this chronic wear and tear physically breaks down the immune system. It causes severe endothelial dysfunction, leading to thickened arteries and cardiovascular disease. It disrupts metabolic functions, accelerating the onset of diabetes.
It literally physically degrades the cellular structure of the body.
Yes, the social environment becomes a biological toxin, and it also acts indirectly but powerfully by altering health-seeking behaviors.
If a patient anticipates experiencing racism or condescension in the clinic waiting room, they engage in anticipatory stress.
And they will naturally delay seeking care until their condition is catastrophic.
So when a hospital implements anti-racism strategies or cultural safety training for its staff, we shouldn't view that as just a corporate HR initiative or a box-ticking exercise for diversity.
Absolutely not. That training is a literal, life-saving public health intervention designed to lower the allostatic load of the patients walking through the door.
The structural barriers are immense, and the biology of marginalization is real. But the data also shows us something incredibly crucial. When self-determination is genuinely prioritized, when land rights are restored, when culture is respected and integrated as a protective factor, community health measurably improves.
Which provides the necessary pivot for us, because we absolutely cannot frame Indigenous health solely through a persistent, exhausting lens of deficit, trauma, and despair. That is only half the picture.
The story of Indigenous health is equally, if not more so, a story of profound continuity, incredible resilience, and enduring strength.
From an epidemiological standpoint, it is absolutely vital to rigorously document positive change. If public health professionals and communities only ever focus on the deficits and the mortality gaps, it breeds a dangerous fatalism.
It leads to public health burnout, where policymakers and clinicians start to believe the problems are simply intractable and unfixable.
But they aren't intractable. We have clear, documented examples of success. We discussed earlier the steadily declining infant mortality rates in Australia and New Zealand, and the overall absolute increases in life expectancy over the last few decades.
But analyzing that success requires a lot of epidemiological sophistication, doesn't it? It's rarely just a simple victory lap.
Tremendous complexity is required. Because in public health, success almost always unmasks new, unforeseen challenges.
Right.
Think back to the epidemiological transition we discussed. If a government successfully implements a massive public health intervention, say clean water infrastructure, and universal vaccination that stops children from dying of infectious diseases, those children now live long enough to develop complex chronic diseases, cardiovascular issues, or cancers much later in life.
Oh, wow. So a naive reading of the morbidity data might suddenly show a massive, terrifying spike in cancer rates within that community.
But that spike is actually a paradoxical downstream result of a massive health success upstream.
And there's also the complex issue of attribution. If a specific health metric rapidly improves in a community, epidemiologists have to figure out exactly why it improved.
Was it because a new medical clinic opened? Was it because of a new housing initiative that reduced mold? Or was it because the community finally won back the legal rights to their ancestral lands, which lowered the community's collective allostatic load and improved their economic base?
Exactly. We have to be able to isolate and attribute the success to a specific structural mechanism so we can fund it, protect it, and replicate it elsewhere. The data proves that these health disparities are not insoluble mysteries of nature. The case studies from around the world prove that systemic change is entirely possible when it is built on a foundation of respect, genuine legal partnership, and indigenous self-determination.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the learner, with a final provocative thought, something to analyze that builds on the frameworks we've discussed today. We are rapidly moving into a new era of global medicine, an era dominated by artificial intelligence, massive genetic databases, and highly personalized precision medicine.
In this new landscape, what happens when indigenous data sovereignty, which is the absolute right of indigenous peoples to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own community's health data, becomes the mandated global standard?
If the historical data deficit was fundamentally an upstream failure of trust and power, could total data sovereignty be the ultimate upstream intervention? Think about how completely controlling the map of their own health might empower communities to entirely change their destination.
That is a profound structural concept to consider as the field evolves. And to assure that the core clinical and policy frameworks we extracted from today's deep dive are firmly cemented in your working memory, we are going to conclude with a targeted recall session.
I will present 6 single best answer style questions based directly on the structural frameworks of the chapter. I will pause briefly after each question. Use that specific pause to formulate the answer in your head before I provide the solution.
Question 1. According to Ford and Harawa, what distinguishes indigeneity and ethnicity from race and public health frameworks? Answer. Race relies on biological essentialism, whereas ethnicity and indigeneity are social constructs, with indigeneity specifically indexing a group's location within a social hierarchy fundamentally shaped by colonialism. You can revisit the cultural and political frameworks section of the text for more detail on this.
Question 2. Why might a nation-state prefer to legally classify an indigenous population as an ethnic minority? Answer. To actively avoid the massive legal and political ramifications of indigenous status under international law, which often involves conceding collective rights to land, resources, and self-determination. Revisit policy and law to consolidate this geopolitical concept.
Question 3. In New Zealand, all-cause mortality rates for both Maori and non-Maori populations declined between 1981 and 2004. However, what happened to the relative health inequality between the two groups? Answer. The relative inequality increased because the mortality rates for the non-Maori population declined at a significantly faster rate than for the Maori population. This is a crucial epidemiological concept found in the headline indicators section. Question 4. Which specific clinical condition occurs at a rate of 40 to 100 per 100,000 in Maori and Pacific children, compared to roughly 1 per 100,000 in non-Maori, highlighting a severe disparity in infectious disease control and housing infrastructure? Answer. Acute rheumatic fever. Review the patterns of morbidity section for more on the downstream impacts of the double burden of disease.
Question 5. In the Australian Indigenous Burden of Disease study, what broad disease category accounts for a staggering 70% of the health gap compared to the total Australian population? Answer. Non-communicable diseases, which crucially includes mental health conditions. This is also covered extensively in patterns of morbidity. Question 6. High rates of emergency hospital admission for ambulatory sensitive conditions in Indigenous populations most directly indicate a functional failure in which specific part of the healthcare system? Answer. Primary healthcare and upstream preventive access. Revisit the strategies for improving health section for more on the critical difference between mere geographical access versus actual clinical utilization. Here are the details of this episode.
Indigenous Peoples, titled Indigenous Peoples Byline. Medlock Holmes explores the health of Indigenous peoples through the lenses of history, sovereignty, structural inequity, resilience, and self-determination. Episode description. Across the world, Indigenous peoples experience disproportionately poorer health outcomes compared with non-Indigenous populations. These disparities are not rooted in culture itself, but in colonization, dispossession, intergenerational trauma, marginalisation, and structural exclusion. This chapter examines life expectancy gaps, chronic disease burden, mental health, suicide, injury, infectious diseases, and access to care among Indigenous communities. It considers how social determinants, land rights, cultural continuity, education, employment, and political representation intersect with health. Indigenous health is framed not only through disadvantage, but through strength, continuity, and resilience. Public health must move from paternalism to partnership. Key takeaways. Indigenous populations often experience significant health inequities. A colonization and historical trauma remain central determinants of health. Chronic disease, injury, and mental health burdens are elevated in many contexts. Cultural continuity and community leadership are protective factors. Self-determination and Indigenous-led health services improve outcomes. Structural reform is required to close health gaps. Respectful partnership is foundational to progress.